On Christmas night in 1991, people gathered around their televisions to watch something almost nobody had expected to see. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. A few minutes later, the red Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin. By the next day, the country was gone. Not defeated in a war, not conquered by a foreign army, simply dissolved. But the most surprising part isn't that the Soviet Union collapsed, it's how little resistance there was when the final moment arrived. To understand what happened, it helps to remember that the Soviet Union wasn't one ordinary country. It was a federation of 15 republics, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. They shared a military, an economy, and a communist government based in Moscow. Officially, the republics had their own institutions and even the right to leave the Union. In practice, Moscow made the important decisions. That arrangement worked as long as the central government remained powerful enough to enforce it. By the 1980s, that power was starting to slip. The Soviet economy was run through government plans. Officials in Moscow set production targets for factories across the country. A factory might be told to produce a certain number of shoes, tons of steel, or pieces of machinery. The problem was that success meant reaching the target, not making something useful. If a nail factory was judged by weight, it could meet its quota by producing enormous nails that nobody needed. Stories like that became Soviet jokes, but the problem was real. Managers learned to satisfy the paperwork rather than the customer. The numbers looked respectable, the products often didn't. For ordinary people, those failures appeared as shortages. Some products were available in one city but missing from another. Fresh food could disappear without warning. A family might wait years for a car or apartment. People became experts at finding things through friends, workplace contacts, and unofficial exchanges. There was even a familiar habit. If you saw a long queue, you joined it first and asked what was being sold afterward. This didn't mean everyone was starving. It meant daily life required time, connections, and constant improvisation. That's exhausting, especially when the government insists everything is going well. During the 1980s, three crises added even more pressure. The war in Afghanistan consumed money and brought home a steady stream of casualties. Oil exports had helped the Soviet government obtain foreign currency. When global oil prices fell, that income dropped. Then, in April 1986, a reactor exploded at Chernobyl. Local officials were slow to warn the public, and the government initially restricted information. But radiation was detected outside the country. Chernobyl showed that secrecy wasn't just dishonest. In a disaster, it could place millions of people at risk. Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985. At 54, he was young by the standards of the Soviet leadership, and he understood that minor adjustments wouldn't be enough. He introduced two reforms that became famous around the world. Perestroika, or restructuring, was supposed to modernize the economy. Glasnost, meaning openness, allowed more honest public discussion. Gorbachev wasn't rejecting socialism. He believed criticism would help remove corruption and make the system work better. It was a reasonable idea. It also assumed that people would criticize the system and then continue supporting it. Under Glasnost, newspapers began publishing stories that would once have been censored. Citizens learned more about Stalin's purges, prison camps, political corruption, Afghanistan, and Chernobyl. Televised political debates attracted huge audiences because people were seeing genuine disagreement in public for the first time. The consequences went far beyond Moscow. In several republics, activists recovered histories that Soviet authorities had suppressed. They discussed deportations, forced annexations, language rights, and earlier independence movements. Glasnost was supposed to create better Soviet citizens. Instead, it helped Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and others imagine political futures outside the Soviet system. Perestroika ran into a different problem. Factories received more freedom, but the government still controlled many prices and supplies. Limited private businesses appeared, but the laws surrounding them were uncertain. The result wasn't a planned economy or a functioning market. It was an unstable combination of both. Factories began withholding products while negotiating better terms. Government finances deteriorated. Empty shelves became more common. Many citizens associated reform with worsening conditions. While economists argued that the reforms hadn't gone far enough, almost everyone agreed that the economy was failing. They strongly disagreed about what should replace it. In 1989, communist governments began falling across Eastern Europe. Poland held competitive elections. Hungary opened its border. East Germans demonstrated in enormous numbers. Then, on November 9th, the Berlin Wall opened. The Soviet Union had used military force to crush earlier uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. This time, Gorbachev refused to intervene. That decision prevented a potentially bloody confrontation. It also proved that Moscow's relationship with its satellite states had changed. Communist power had always depended partly on the possibility of force. Once that possibility faded, governments that had appeared permanent collapsed within months. In March 1991, the Soviet government held a referendum on preserving a renewed union. About 76% of participating voters supported it. That sounds like a clear result, but it hid a complicated reality. 6 republics, including the 3 Baltic states, boycotted the vote, and many of those who voted yes wanted a radically different federation with far more local control. Most people weren't choosing between the old Soviet Union and immediate collapse. They were imagining several different versions of the future. The vote confirmed that many wanted cooperation. It didn't answer who would control it. The most serious challenge came from Russia itself. Boris Yeltsin, once a Communist Party official, had become a popular critic of Gorbachev and an advocate of faster change. Russia declared that its laws took priority over Soviet laws. Then, in June 1991, Yeltsin won a national election to become president of the Russian Republic. This produced an extraordinary situation. Gorbachev was president of the Soviet Union, but he had never won a nationwide popular election for that office. Yeltsin had. 2 governments now operate in Moscow, competing for authority over many of the same people and institutions. Gorbachev tried to settle the conflict through a new Union treaty. The republics would receive greater control over their economies and governments while cooperating on matters such as defense. Several republics were preparing to sign. To communist hardliners, this looked like the destruction of the country they had spent their careers defending. They feared losing their positions, their ideology, and Moscow's control over the republics. The treaty was scheduled to be signed on August 20th. On August 19th, senior officials placed Gorbachev under house arrest and announced that they had taken power. Tanks appeared on Moscow streets, but the coup leaders never looked fully in control. During a televised press conference, one official's hands visibly trembled. Yeltsin traveled to the Russian parliament, climbed onto a tank, and called the takeover illegal. Crowds arrived to defend the building and constructed barricades around it. The decisive question was whether the military would attack. Some commanders supported the coup. Others remained neutral or refused to move against civilians. Without unified military support, the plotters couldn't enforce their orders. After 3 confused and dangerous days, the coup collapsed. Its leaders were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But he returned to a different country. The failed coup transformed Yeltsin into the most powerful politician in Moscow. He suspended Communist Party activity in Russia and took control of important Soviet institutions. Gorbachev remained president, but his authority now depended on decisions made by the republics. Those republics moved quickly. Estonia and Latvia restored their independence. Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and others issued declarations of independence. The hardliners had launched the coup because they feared the proposed treaty would weaken the Union. Their failure made even that weakened Union impossible to enforce. Ukraine declared independence shortly after the coup, but its leaders wanted public approval. A referendum was held on December 1st. More than 90% voted for independence. Every region produced a majority, including areas with large Russian-speaking populations. The size of that victory ended serious hopes of keeping Ukraine inside a reformed Soviet federation. Ukraine had more than 50 million people, major industries, valuable agricultural land, military forces, and nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. A union without Ukraine would be dramatically smaller and strategically weaker. Yeltsin also had little interest in preserving a Soviet government above his own Russian presidency. The final decision now belonged to the Republic leaders. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a government residence in the Belovezha forest. They signed an agreement stating that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. In its place, they proposed a much looser Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev criticized the decision, arguing that 3 leaders had no right to dissolve a country. Legally, the situation was messy. Politically, his options were limited. Russia controlled the Soviet government's center. Ukraine had voted to leave. Other republics were already acting independently. There was no practical mechanism left for Gorbachev to reverse their decision. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag came down that evening, and the Union was formally dissolved the following day. Its collapse looked sudden because the final political decisions happened quickly, but each decision followed logically from the one before it. Economic failure encouraged reform. Reform weakened censorship. Openness strengthened national movements. The loss of Eastern Europe showed that Moscow might not intervene. Russia created a rival government. The coup destroyed the remaining authority of the Soviet center, and Ukraine's referendum removed the possibility of rebuilding the Union in any recognizable form. No single event caused the collapse. What made 1991 different was that the army, the party, the republics, and the public no longer agreed on what the Soviet Union should be, or who had the right to decide. Once that agreement disappeared, the map changed with astonishing speed.